Hello, all. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Alix Saba, and I am the Interim Executive Director at the African Studies Association. And I just want to thank you all for being here today for this very important event co-hosted by the ASA Women's Caucus. I do want to let you know that we will be recording at least the first significant portion of the event, which will be publicly posted. And then we will shut off the recording to allow a little bit more free dialogue. So thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our incredible speakers today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Martha Ndakalako. I am the co-convener of the Women's Caucus with Harmony O'Rourke, and I will be moderating today, and I'll talk a little bit more about the structure in a second. But I want to welcome you to this ASA members exclusive roundtable discussion on the topic of COVID, gender and academia, pandemic impacts on hiring, promotion, and tenure review. The topic is titled after research done last year by the Women's Caucus Steering Committee, Harmony O'Rourke, Anita Plummer, Tshepo, Masango, Chery, and Beth Ann Williams. This work culminated in a statement by the Women's Caucus, which includes policy recommendations, advice for junior faculty, and a list of resources posted on the Women's Caucus website. So today gives the ASA community an opportunity to hear from Harmony, Anita, and Tshepo, and really discuss this research, to consider its afterlives, and for us as a community to consider next steps or how we've been navigating the concerns that this research has raised. So at this point, I will introduce our roundtable speakers, and then turn the discussion over to them. We really want to keep the discussion sort of free-flowing and somewhat democratic, so don't save your questions till the end. Feel free to raise your hands and ask your questions or post to the chat, and we'll just keep an eye on that and ask your questions as we go. So I will introduce our speakers at this point. Harmony O'Rourke is currently lead co-convener of the ASA Women's Caucus and professor of history at Pitzer College. Her book, Khadija's Story, Diaspora, Gender, and Belonging in the Cameroon Grassfields, published in 2017 by Indiana University Press, disrupted dominant androcentric narratives of Hausa diaspora formation in West Africa, which have historically emphasized long-distance trade and male projects to construct a cohesive social order. Khadija's Story illustrates how the gender dynamics of kinship, bondage, travel, death, religious knowledge, and authority shaped discourses and anxieties over belonging. Her scholarship has also appeared in History in Africa, a journal of method, the Journal of West African, and the Journal of West African History. Her invited essay on the history of women in Cameroon for Oxford University Press's Research Encyclopedia of African History was published in 2020, and she is currently at work on 3 projects: an invited essay on gender, ethnicity, and Islam in post-colonial Africa for the journal History Compass, a co-authored essay with Beth Ann Williams on gender, religion, and belief in world history for Bloomsbury Press, and an oral history of the 1986 Lake Nyos disaster in Cameroon. Our next speaker, Anita Plummer, is an assistant professor of African Studies. Her research and teaching focus on African political economy, transnationalism, and Sino-African relations. Before joining the faculty at Howard, she taught international studies at Spelman College, was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Cultures in Transnational Perspective program, and visiting assistant professor of global studies and political science at UCLA, and was a Carter G. Woodson Center pre-doctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. Dr. Plummer has conducted research in China, Kenya, South Africa, Mozambique, and Senegal. Her articles on China's engagement in Africa have been published in the National Political Science Review, the Journal of Asian and African Studies, and the Africa Focus Bulletin, and Foreign Policy in Focus. Her current book project, Kenya's Engagement with China, Discourse, Power, and Agency, focuses on grassroots perspectives and responses to China's increased political and economic interventions in Africa. She currently serves as the Associate Director for Research and Faculty Engagement at Howard University's Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. And I was going to say final speaker, but this is a roundtable. Our next speaker is Tshepo Masango Chery. Tshepo Masango Chery is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Houston. She is a South African scholar who turns to religion as a site from which to historicize liberation struggles in Africa. Her current book project, Kingdom Come, The Politics of Faith and Freedom in Segregationist South Africa and Beyond, forthcoming in Duke University Press, traces the intersecting paths of Black radicals who rely on Christianity, and more specifically institution building, as a space to organize and respond politically to oppressive states in segregationist South Africa, the Jim Crow South in America, and colonial Zimbabwe and Kenya. Critically attuned to the function of race, gender, and class, Masango Chery's research seeks to understand and redefine our own notions of what it means to be free and experience freedom in Southern African history. Her work has been supported by the Fontaine Society, the Carter G. Woodson Institute, the John Warfield Center, the Annenberg Foundation, and the Institute for Citizen and Scholar, formerly known as the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. So at this point, I will turn it over to Harmony to begin our roundtable discussion of this very important work.
Thank you so much, Martha. That was just wonderful. And I want to acknowledge Alix Saba, who is single-handedly managing ASA right now for everyone. She's just has so much on her plate, and she's been such a stalwart supporter of the Women's Caucus all of this time, all of last year since I've been involved. And I really want us to acknowledge all of the heavy pressure and work that she has, and she's created this space for us. So I just really want to acknowledge her. Her work. One thing I'm going to do first, and one thing we decided, you guys can all unmute yourselves. It looks like we're a smaller group this morning. This could be, as I think the AA is like Women's Caucus is, and our sort of feminist leadings, right? We have co-conveners, we don't have presidents and chairs, is to sort of decenter ourselves as much as possible, put a frame out there, but really to hear from everybody. And again, like Alix said, and that this is something we just discussed right before opening it up, is that if you want to share anything personal or have more sort of biting comments that you may not want to have out there publicly, there will be a moment where we're going to stop the recording and have, if we need to, which we probably do, a more sort of frank conversation that you may not want to, for things that you might want to reveal in a way that you don't want publicized. I know I do, or I have. What I'm going to do right now is I put in the chat the link to our statement. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm sure some folks are going to be dropping in throughout this talk today or this roundtable. So what I wanted to first do is just sort of talk about why we did the statement last year, and how I think the statement goes further than I think most other scholarly organization statements do, and why we decided to do that. And then again, I think today is also a time for us to hear back from ASA members and to see where we need to push things further, because we actually had a whole bunch of other ideas, but we did enough last year. We couldn't go further. It was enough. We got a little bit burnt out. I also want to say that there is going to be an ASA sponsored roundtable on this topic at the annual meeting this year. And we will all be speaking there as well as Beth Ann Williams, who was able to join us today. She wasn't sure if she could. So our membership secretary is here, and she worked really hard on this with all of us last year too. So I just wanted to acknowledge her. Okay, so enough of all of that stuff. Let's get into the meat, or the meat of the mango if we're vegetarian or whatever. So again, why did we do this? I think a lot of us, we had colleagues, I myself, we were all going through this really difficult circumstance, ongoing with no end in sight, and having these long-term effects in terms of, being able to do any work at all, or even being able to do our minimal work of teaching, well. And I had colleagues in multiple disciplines who were struggling with trying to explain to their colleagues in terms of going up for tenure or whatever it is, what exactly they were going through. And, you know, depending on your positionality, things can look like whining, things can look like, you know, like you're not trying hard enough, or you're just not finding a way or whatever. And we felt it was really important to put together hard data, because by the time we wrote this, more information was coming out, just what the gendered and racial impacts were of the pandemic on our colleagues. And that I knew that if I told some of my colleagues, well, look to your scholarly organization, maybe they've put out a statement that you can point to in your tenure statement or your file or whatever, your job application or whatever it is, that shows that you are part of systemic inequalities. What you're going through is not just your personal issue, it's a broader issue that everyone is facing. And so this is something we really wanted to do for the Women's Caucus, for our members. And this is something that kind of just, you know, when I'm thinking about Tshepo's book, you know, getting the contract with Duke University Press, we're just so happy for, I think our organization is very much about our members succeeding in a way that maybe, I know all of the other affiliate organizations may have that as well, but I feel like the Women's Caucus, that's one of our main things. We want to see our members succeed. We want to make sure gender and women become centralized in academia and in our scholarly associations. And so I feel like we had a particular role to play in all of this, and creating not just a statement that is well researched and not just theoretical, ideological, blah, 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 but like really well researched, and then also providing resources and policy recommendations. Because again, a lot of these statements can also be for, you know, junior colleagues or people on the job market, but we also wanted to speak to our colleagues and give them resources who are in positions of power at their institutions, and that can actually make things change in their institutions. So we wanted to kind of go further than most other academic or scholarly organization statements in providing all of that research, policy recommendations, and resources. So that's something that we worked on. And I do want to say this was a completely wonderful collaborative effort. We all put our hands in it, the four of us together. And it was, I think it was really hard, but it really, I think for me personally, it really helped me to have those connections with three people I care about during such a hard time. Anita is going to talk a little bit about the policy recommendations, and Tshepo is going to talk more about the resources. I wanted to just pull out a few strands from the research statement. Oops, I'm pulling up the wrong document, of course. Where did it go? There it is. And I would say our overarching thesis here, right, is that, you know, how can we all be a voice, right, in encouraging institutions to see the pandemic as an entry point into creating a more equitable scholarly community rather than returning to a pre-pandemic status quo. These things magnified stuff that's already there. We cannot lose this opportunity to make substantive changes for the future. So that's kind of our overarching statement there. And in terms of the threads that came through our research, again, the sort of issues of the overlap of productive and reproductive labor for our members was just, you cannot ignore it, even though many institutions and departments would like to. This is a time for us to make visible the invisible and too often professionally unrewarded care work, both at home and in the workplace and in institutions. For our African colleagues, both in Africa and here, who are helping family members in Africa, all of that sort of emotional labor, that financial stress that people felt that is just often, again, not acknowledged. And again, this is where I think our statement goes further. We wanted, again, a lot of the research is on the US, but we wanted to make this a more global recognize the global nature of this global pandemic and how it's affecting colleagues in African institutions as well. We have hard data. There is, for a fact, declining research productivity. There are fewer article submissions, especially single authored by women faculty. It's just clear. And there are also women faculty are starting fewer new projects. We have data for all of that in terms of grant submissions, you name it. And I'm sure we could probably update that some of that material in the statement. And again, lastly, fortunately, there was this really great study that was put out last year, and then it was publicized in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Again, the gender gap persists. Even with male caregivers and female caregivers, there's still a gender gap. It still is different. And it is simply undeniable that women faculty with caregiving responsibilities, and I include that not just dependent children, but we're talking about elder care, we're talking about family in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, right? Community issues that are most, in communities that were most affected by this. They compared to faculty who were non-caregivers and compared to men caregivers as well, these women bore the brunt of lost research output, spending less time than usual on drafting and publishing books, monographs, working papers, article manuscripts, and conference papers. So these are just things that I wanted to those are some of the main takeaways from our research. We have a whole bunch of other ideas about how you could push that research forward, but I'm going to leave that discussion for later in the hour. And I just want to turn over to Anita right now, who's going to talk about some of our policy recommendations.
Great, thank you so much, Harmony. When you said that coming together to put together these materials for me, it was like therapy working with the three of you. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to work on this project. For folks who are streaming on YouTube, you can visit our website at www.asawomenscaucus.com because you don't have the privilege of seeing what's in the chat. So if you want to see the full statement, you can Google us too. So when we started this project, we thought a lot about the different responses of institutions to COVID-19 based on our own diverse experiences, because the four of us come from very different institutions. And we were thinking, about both the short and long-term impact that COVID policies could have on individual faculty, and also the practice and culture around evaluation, promotion, and tenure generally. And that's what Harmony was talking about. There's definitely a culture around it that is unequal and unequitable to women. So it's very clear that many women have carried and continue to carry many burdens in our familial, community, and professional lives. So in addition to those barriers that we have, those burdens, we have barriers in terms of how we move through academic institutions and hopefully move up in our careers. So when we crafted the recommendations, we wanted to be very practical. We wanted practical actions that both untenured faculty could make. And I think Tshepo will talk a bit about the resources, but we concluded that a lot of the advocacy falls on the shoulders of tenured faculty members and administration. We have to take into consideration, the power dynamics within this space, which are, very problematic depending on your institution, on your department. So at the outset, it's varied in terms of how different institutions responded in the culture within departments and institutions. So we're not making any assumptions in terms of our recommendations, but we hope that they'll be useful. So firstly, many schools responded to COVID by offering the 1-year extension on the clock. In some cases, an individual could opt in or opt out, depending on if it was automatic or not. But this was not universal. In many cases, including my own, I had the option to include a COVID impact statement in my yearly evaluation file. And that would serve presumably as the basis for any special consideration or accommodation in my evaluation. So when the four of us discussed this policy, we found that it could create a divide because the burden of reporting, including details about our family life or personal concerns, falls more heavily on those already most burdened by the pandemic itself. So that may cause faculty to choose not to ask for extensions or report the reality of their situations, making them manage the pandemic alone. So we recommended that schools provide tenure and funding relief measures uniformly across the campus without mandating those requests of specific faculty. Similarly, for institutions accepting the COVID impact statements, we recommend that this also be requested uniformly across campus. Again, the burden shouldn't be on those who need it the most. But at the same time, the advocacy and any measures in terms of accommodations should be taken on by full professors and the administrations. Institutions should be transparent and systematic in terms of how the information within these impact statements will be used to evaluate performance. For example, are there new sets of metrics or rubrics being used to account for additional work or delayed work in this period? If not, these conversations have to take place. Again, transparency and uniformity become very important. We also, in our statement, in our recommendations, emphasize that giving more time is not a response in itself. We know that there have been studies on how problematic, the tenure clock extensions can be. Notably because there are different people in different stages of the tenure process. So if you're in your first or second year, extending could be very useful. But if you're like me, and you're in your 4th or 5th year and you're trying to get a book contract, it's a bit more difficult to fully take advantage of that clock extension. So with that, we advise senior colleagues and their institutions to research and correct historical gendered imbalances in income and recruit retirement earnings for those faculty who've decided to delay promotion and tenure to create a family life. So that's beyond COVID. There needs to be more research at an institutional level to see how these policies are impacting faculty. Stopping the clock may treat all faculty in terms of gender equally, but it's not an equitable practice. Women faculty have significant barriers to promotion and thus maximizing earning potential across their working lives. So, when women stop the clock, we're doing so at a cost, literal cost in terms of our earning potential. We also urge faculty members who make up tenure and promotion committees, as well as hiring committees, which is a different category, to review academic candidates with new standards in mind that reflect the equity that this particular moment demands. Even though we're acknowledging that there have been historical gender imbalances, but something different is happening here. And again, it begins with conversations like the one we're having here. And then putting into place new sets of guidelines and practices that systematically account for the impacts of COVID on teaching, service, and research, those 3 pillars that all of our files are based on. More specifically, we ask senior faculty and administrators to set a tone within their departments and institutions by emphasizing the importance of quality over quantity and evaluating scholarship and artistic production. As Harmony mentioned, so I'm not going to get into it, the peer review process has been slowed down because of COVID. So what we had in place needs to be altered, right? It needs to be shifted. Committees should acknowledge the increased workloads for transforming courses to remote learning. The work from home paradigm was a lot of work. So how are we accounting for that within the evaluation process? Additionally, Harmony already mentioned this, but many of us were facilitating workshops, seminars, community forums, op-eds, digital content. We were activists too, in addition to academics, because of the protests that were happening, gender-based violence, all of these issues were happening. So we have to expand our view in terms of what we consider productivity, especially in public intellectual spaces. Finally, we should really think about what enhanced mentorship looks like in this moment. How are senior faculty helping to guide junior faculty through this process? And reflecting these changes within the tenure file appropriately, within whatever institutional standards are in place. So broadly, we talked a bit about crisis preparedness. And when we wrote we were thinking about the pandemic, we were thinking about climate change, but at Howard this year, we have had a series of bomb threats that have really impacted our community. We're dealing with mass shooting situations. So we have to really be proactive in terms of how we're engaging with crisis preparedness policies at colleges and universities. Because the impacts are very gendered in terms of how students respond, staff and administrators respond to crises as they appear. And then finally, we call on men to serve as allies. So that's the final part of our recommendation, which is very important. Most of the research that looks at COVID and gender has been authored by women. So we encourage our male colleagues to also contribute. And we ask them to actively collaborate as we're developing these rubrics, these metrics, these policies, to establish a culture of equitable practices on campus. Practically speaking, we're asking also our male colleagues to mentor women colleagues, especially if they've moved up the ranks and have institutional memory experience and even relationships. So I'm going to stop there because I'm hoping that we can talk about what our institutions have done. Maybe we need to modify some of these recommendations, add to them. So yeah, thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Tshepo now.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and what time you're watching this. But we do want to welcome all of you here to our space. I think in many ways, this might offer you some insight as to the kind of community that we have formed and we've cultivated through the Women's Caucus, one that's inclusive, one that is also dynamic. And as Harmony said, I want to emphasize that the document is a living document. It's one that we see as sort of a framing of things, but also a space where we might reflect and continue to change the document as we see fit. I mentioned that because we're meeting in June, about a year from the moment in which we started actually creating this document. So there's been time for us also to reflect as individuals, but now time for us to discuss the document. I think there's space for us to think about this document as more than just a statement. Perhaps we might even want to change the language around it, because on the one hand, it is a statement about COVID, but on the other hand, as Anita has sort of unpacked for us, it offers a number of policy recommendations, but also best practices. And then in our next section, the section that I'm talking about, resources. And the resources are quite robust. So it works as more than something as a political or cultural statement about how we might navigate COVID, but also as I think a hub of thinking through and organizing institutions and universities, not just in the US, but also on the continent, we hope. And that being said, I hope that it is something that is circulated. I know that statements are they function as sort of the front page of something, but this is a document which I would suggest people work through. There's quite a lot of information here to get through. It's not something that you would get through in one sitting. But I'll offer sort of my reflections about the resources and spaces and places to look through. So, and just as an aside, I do think it's worthwhile as sort of taking sacred pause and noting that we're talking about over 6 million people who've passed away from COVID and the aftermath of that. We're in a different moment in this pandemic, perhaps actually a moment in which we really need to lean heavily on a document like this, because there's kind of a sort of desensitization of the pandemic and its impact, right? So people are emotionally trying to move past the notion that there is actually an ongoing pandemic in its sort of end stages, perhaps, depending on how you view things medically. But certainly we know that the impact is still it's still overwhelming. Just for reference, in the first 10 weeks in the US in particular, when our lockdown occurred, there was actually a 35% increase in productivity among in the academy overall. But if you looked at those numbers, as we're suggesting, that increase actually could be largely attributed to our male colleagues. And we saw a major decrease in output from our female colleagues and colleagues who were major caregivers. So for the resources, one of the main things that we've been saying over and over, and I think I should be very clear about it, we really want our members, people who are connected to us in ASA and also beyond, to really think about their networks, their professional networks. Oftentimes we think about this in a very nebulous nature, and we are actually suggesting that in this moment that people account professionally for who they might understand as being a part of their network and what kinds of networks they need to build up and also reach out to at this point. That's one of our main statements when you get to the resource page, is who is your network, work your network, and I would add build your network. We have we don't necessarily in formal terms call them a sister organization, but there's quite some overlap in the Women's Caucus and also the African Feminist Initiative. And I see Alicia is here, who has spearheaded quite a number of initiatives around it. But that, I think, is one such example of a space where we've been actively thinking about what mentorship looks like and actually creating a space for mentorship. I mentioned that space, but also the Coordinating Council for Women in History, because these are spaces where mentorship has been formalized. And so there are a number of us female academics who may not have been strategically thinking about our networks and may not know where to turn. So I'm pointing to those organizations as spaces that are actually institutionalized, mentorship spaces. There you can get a formal mentor who you can do quite a bit of work and it doesn't necessarily even matter at what stage you are in the process, whether you're a graduate student, assistant professor, associate professor, there are spaces there. In addition, if that might be too intimate, that space in particular offers a number of workshops to think through a great deal of issues. In fact, they canvassed their membership to ask what were their needs. And I took a moment to get sort of in the weeds there because I want people to know that there are actual places that you can go. That's actually hyperlinked in our document itself. So beyond that, though, something Anita said is really important, which is really know the culture of your institutions, the expectations that are in place, not just on the university level or your college level, but also within your department. So you understand how the evaluations are going to work. You understand how your tenure documents might work or your promotion documents might work. And that's really critical when we get to the resources. There are a whole lot of resources here. So it might move you in a lot of different directions, some of which you might not need, but I think you need to have a pointed mission as to what you're searching for within those resources to make really good use of what we've pulled together. There were some sort of leading institutions initially who had really worked hard to pull together a lot of resources. I'll mention Villanova as one of those spaces. And that's a very useful sort of site to get those initial thoughts around COVID policies, some of the research. Our space, I think it actually enhanced all of that. So what you're going to see within our resources is you might see sort of provost directions or presidential directions from universities as to how to think about creating a COVID impact statement. It's worthwhile to look across universities to get a sense of what's being compiled within that. We found that they varied quite dramatically. So for instance, if you're at an institution that is largely teaching, you'll see that there's a lot of language that you can pull from to describe the kinds of changes that you might have gone through during the pandemic, or even now, kind of the aftermath of switching to technology or all virtual and then switching perhaps back, and how to deal with that, how to account for changes in perhaps your evaluations, how to account for the new preps you might have done, how to actually even account for the ways that your classroom, for instance, might have been changed because you do field work or you take your students to sites that a virtual space does not allow for. Those things need to be documented. Oftentimes we take these things for granted because we just sort of do things on the fly. But that's a really, these documents sort of point to what should be documented. The other thing, and I'll wrap this up because there's so much that we could talk about, but the other thing that I think is worthwhile to think about is there are multiple sets of documents that are going out that are accounting for this pandemic moment. Obviously, many of us quickly turn to thinking about tenure and promotion. Those are critical documents. Those need to be in a formal nature. So there's plenty of information on that. But we also wanted our members to think about the fact that these annual reviews actually do have a great impact on how someone might see your file across time and space. What would it mean even if your department was not requesting a COVID impact statement? How do you actually use not just your own personal narrative, but the research, the statistics overall to infuse it within your annual review for a more robust rendering of what you did during that time? The other thing that we wanted people to think about is that the correspondence, whether it's through a memo or an email, through formalized chains of power to your chair, to a director, to a provost, so on and so forth, that we didn't want you to sort of feel the emotional burden of disclosing everything that you are working through, but enough that you could be strategic. And the best way of doing that, we found, was to turn to the research. So we have all these citations that talk about the shift in of the nature of work. We have citations that that mention sort of this social capital, economic capital, remittance kind of lifestyle that some people are living transnationally across the continent, also in Europe, so on and so forth. So just sort of seeing this space as a bank, to a bank of templates to formalize any kind of communication where you're explaining your situation, but doing it in a way that is deeply professional and undergirded by research. So I'll stop there. And I think we're going to, I think Martha will take over, but I know that there's a number of head nodding and we've all sort of gone through our own renditions of what this moment has meant to our scholarship. So I know we'll have an amazing conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Tshepo, Harmony, and Anita. So does anybody want to ask any questions, or you can post them in the chat as well?
And again, we're really happy for everyone to unmute and just kind of have more of a conversation. Again, knowing that this portion of the talk will be made public.
I just want to thank you, all of you, for taking the time to write this statement. There's so many statements that need to be written right now, and it's such an amount of labor, and it's so meaningful to be able to go to the Women's Caucus and to be able to draw from the work that you've done to, work with my colleagues as they're working on their promotion and tenure documents and whatnot. So just thank you so much for putting the time into this. This is by far the best statement I've seen, and I've seen it widely circulated. So that's really heartening. So just wanted to say thank you.
Well, that's very heartening that it's being circulated. Thank you, Alicia.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the thanks. I think this is amazing. the amount of work you put in and everything. It's really, really comprehensive.
I mean, maybe we could open it up. Was there anything sort of that spoke to you from it? Anything that sort of surprised you? You know, I think for me, this is part of Anita's, the policy recommendations. The stopping the tenure clock thing, which is just the sort of panacea for all gender things, has always bothered me. And I will say this publicly, right? So I was hired with a few colleagues at Pitzer, and I had my second child, another colleague had, and two of my male colleagues did have children. I think one of them took parental leave, but I was the only one who had to stop. I really needed to stop the tenure clock. Lots of biological, social reasons for that. And I, because I went up later, I then, went up later for also full professor, and I'm always going to make less than these two male colleagues who are my friends, my brothers, who came in with me. And I work at a really great institution, and I think they've tried to actually rectify that. I did use the pandemic, or as an opening for this discussion, and luckily we have a really great sort of feminist treasurer at Pitzer. But so that kind of thing, for institutions to do the research, okay, of who takes parental leave, is there a gender imbalance in terms of who then goes up later, who stops the clock, and to do that research. And if there is a gender imbalance in there, which I know at my institution there is, and I'm sure there is across the board, that means that when people want to start a family, women are losing earning potential, which has compounded effects for retirement and everything else. So this is something that should stop. We should stop doing it. Yes, stop the clock, but you have to figure out financially what the costs are and stop it. This should not be happening anymore. And for people then, I have, friends now who stopped the clock 2 years because of having a child and then also COVID. That is compounded even more. They're always going to make less than their male counterparts. This is not okay. I think it's immoral. So that's one of those examples of let's use this moment to make some really substantial changes. And again, I feel like our statement is much more direct on that issue than I've seen across the board. But again, I think we all would like to hear what sort of spoke to a lot of you, what you think maybe more needs to be put in there. We actually didn't talk about people being sick, our colleagues being sick, people suffering from long COVID, brain fog. That is coming out more in the fore right now too. Studies on domestic violence in the home with children and women and the way that impacts scholarly communities are not immune from such difficulties. So there are many areas in which we could move this discussion further. So I just really want to open up and see what folks are thinking, what's been useful, what sort of stood out to them, and what more maybe we could be doing.
Harmony, you mentioned people being sick, and I was actually thinking about this as I was rereading the statement. And so I was kind of, one of the joys that quickly became a not so much joy was, being able to switch to online teaching and, the idea of being at home. But quickly, of course, that turned into, stress that I won't get into right now. But I just started my job here. This is my first year at Gustavus. And I found, and I was doing a teaching model where a hybrid teaching model. So part of my teaching was in person and then part of it was online. But what I found with having the option to go online was when I was sick, and I got sick a few times over the semester, I was just like, okay, well, I mean, we already have this online platform. I'm just gonna roll out of bed and, I can teach for an hour or, my 3 classes for an hour, and then I can just go back to bed. And, there was a week, I think in January or February, where I got the flu or whatever, and I was sick for 3 weeks. And I did this, I just kind of, roll out of bed and taught. And at some point I remember saying to my students, wait, if I didn't have this online option, I would have just, assigned some kind of project and you all would be working on it and I would stay home and just take the day off. But because, I have this option, now I just kind of roll it into my teaching since I've already been teaching online. It didn't feel like work, but of course it was, And so I started thinking about, this kind of thing that happens, right? Like the things that we think of as positive or that we don't realize are, sort of upping the work, things that we normally wouldn't have done before, but now we're doing them on top of everything else, So I just, I was thinking about that and maybe, I don't know, other people have this experience, we could talk about it. Long story, going forward, I'm going to be sick. I'm going to take the time, But it was just one of those things where I did it, since I had already been teaching online, it didn't feel like an extra step because I wasn't like putting on clothing and going to the office. I was at home. I could just turn on my computer. I could facilitate discussion as well as I could, and then, go back to bed. But in retrospect, of course, it is labor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So relatedly, there are a few studies on our resources page that look at the switch to work from home and how faculty member with small children, the work from home was not as convenient as for folks with older children or who didn't have caregiving responsibilities. So privacy issues were completely skewed. If I had children in the middle of a recorded Zoom, run into the office and, they want to engage with folks, but personal space and private space and professional spaces were completely skewed with the work from home Zoom format. And it became difficult very quickly for me. It was not easy. Taking classes, literally in my closet so I could have privacy and some silence because, we didn't have childcare at the height of the pandemic. And even afterwards, it was very difficult. So I think you're right. I've heard colleagues who love the work from home format because it's convenient. But for me, as soon as I was able to teach on campus, I was on campus because I needed, as a mother of 2 young children, my own space outside of the home. I needed to have my identity on campus separate from my personal mother identity as a mother. So you're right, it's very varied. And it was so unexpected because I was like, oh, it's going to be convenient being able to teach. And it really wasn't a lot of the time. It caused anxiety because I did not know who was going to burst through the door at any given moment to disrupt my class, which is supposed to be a sacred space in itself, right? So different from you, Martha, but I empathize that there are unintended consequences that one can't predict unless you're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of the things, just sort of reflecting on both of your thoughts on this, one of the things that I try to be proactive about at my university is passing this along to senior colleagues and really asking them to take a moment and look at it because I think, there are all these iterations under which junior colleagues in particular who oftentimes, but not always, had younger children or were sort of extending themselves in ways that they didn't always feel comfortable disclosing to senior colleagues because of how they might process it. I was pushing senior colleagues to take a look at this and to advocate from the top because not necessarily having the experience, they weren't always attuned to all the different things that junior colleagues were dealing with at the time. Like you all, I just sort of powered through the virtual teaching space, but I was doing it as an only daughter of South Africans who were hit hard by COVID, and had a father who was hospitalized for at least 2 months, who was also an academic. So I taught his class in South Africa and I taught my classes in the US. And my colleagues were not, they knew that this was happening, but they couldn't process like what that meant for productivity, what it meant for submitting a manuscript that was due, just the nitty gritty execution of things. And then over time, this issue of being desensitized, I think that's really the thing we're going to have to deal with, is how do we continue to sort of amplify the impact of the pandemic on all of us? Because, at a certain point, I lost 20 family members to COVID. And at a certain point, my colleagues could not process the loss. So they were just like, okay, we get it. We're really sorry. Now let's talk about committee work, right? And so those are these things that we need to think about and account for, and helping these senior scholars articulate some of these, some of the hardships that people face.
And I also just want to put in, we don't want to assume that everyone has a tenure track position. It was really important for this to be, which is, increasing, given what's happening in academic institutions. We also wanted this to be a space, and this is where the mentorship piece came in as well. And also to think about, more and more places. I don't know if institutions are asking applicants for jobs for COVID impact statements, probably not. But some, like Pitzer, do ask for diversity statements. We wanted to be very mindful about our graduate students and contingent faculty and faculty on the job market. Or faculty in postdoc situations, and Beth Ann is at one in Florida. So this was also really important to us too. So I just wanted to say that as well. We're not assuming that people, that our members are, everyone has this great, privileged opportunity of having a tenure track position. And that we do think the statement and the resources can be very, very helpful for people on the job market.
And I'm sort of wondering, I think we're in a really great and unique position to be interdisciplinary at ASA. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is how do we account for our training, right? So some of us, like if you're an anthropologist, how are you actually helping your graduate students account for that? If you're a historian, what are we doing about archives? And thanks for all of you all who are joining and had to run off. But I think we need to start thinking and culling resources about how to sort of pivot our training for our students. Even as borders have opened up, things are much more complicated economically for people to gain funding, to travel, to do all of these things. And I think especially for women of color, I think we have to account for them, because once we get through one iteration of graduate training, I think that our job market applicants are going to look very different. And we're not thinking about that. Who finishes the PhD and who gets out on the other side, whether it's in the academy or elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've all been talking, just wondering if other folks have comments or things that they might need, or experiences to share, or things that were done at their institutions that were either beneficial or potentially harmful, that,
And I was also wondering, if you have something to share, but you're worried about the recording, just say so, and then we can also stop the recording and have a more intimate conversation. Go.
Okay, yeah. All right, I think we should stop. Yes, Alex, yeah, thank you. And thanks to everybody who maybe watches this on YouTube for checking us out.
And a special thanks to Beth Ann, who was present and did a lot of work here. So we're thankful that she was able to join us.
Yeah.